Level 989.
Welcome to 989 on Health, where you don't need years of university to understand the latest news about health and related subjects. As always, we've created a list of helpful links on today's topic at our website, level989.com, and those same links should also be available in your podcast playing app of choice.
This is an informal discussion sharing our personal viewpoints on health and wellness. Don't rely on the information in this podcast as an alternative to medical advice from a professional healthcare provider. For the full disclaimer, please see our website.
I'm Mike Davalos, just a guy, your average Joe, and I'm joined by the opposite of average, Brandon Weintraub, a primary care physician. Good morning, Brandon.
Good morning, Mike.
Our topic for today is depression, which is going to be a tricky one, I think, and perhaps our longest episode to date. As complex as the biology of diabetes, stress, digestion, or any of our other topics have been, depression is exponentially more intricate. Even bleeding-edge medical science can explain how conscious self-awareness is created by a twisty, wrinkly, 3-pound blob of cells in our skulls. Now, Brandon, we're going to need to peel this topic like an onion, and there are many, many strange layers that we're going to need to tease out if we're going to make any sense of depression. And I think that properly defining consciousness itself seems like a necessary starting point.
Cogito ergo concurro. I think, therefore I agree.
There are many different approaches science has tried to better understand consciousness, and most of them get debunked after further study. It might be something like the struggle between classical physics and quantum physics. We may need to start over with a totally new model. One approach that doesn't have a ton of evidence but could act as a useful mental model regarding consciousness is that there are layers or forms of consciousness. Now, this might seem an odd place to start, but let's use a somewhat simpler life form than humans to start out with. Maybe we could use a cat. Now, you and I both have cats, and I know we both love our little fur babies, but they don't have the mental capacity of a human. What can you tell us about the first two forms of consciousness, sensory experience and practical consciousness? From the point of view of a cat, of course. Meow.
We are starting right out of the gate this podcast with a theory I'm not terribly familiar with, but I'll do my best. The first form of consciousness in this theory, discussed in the paper Globalization and Global Consciousness, is sensory experience, the, quote, sense that something exists in relation to or has an impact on a person, end quote. Sensory experience is consciousness embodied by experience, felt but not necessarily reflected upon. In terms of our cat example, think of it as the feeling of a sunbeam while lying on a fluffy blanket, or the taste of fresh salmon stolen from your owner's plate. The second form you mentioned is practical consciousness. This involves knowing how to do things. This is something like ingrained instinct or muscle memory. You know how to eat, how to drink, how to protect yourself from other cats that invade your territory, even without having to think about the action themselves.
All right, and next up are reflective and reflexive consciousnesses. These are two very similar ideas that involve processing and considering the data that's been collected in the first two forms, along with your past experience, and making decisions on that data to shape your future actions. These forms also involve thinking about thinking, and understanding that other people are conscious beings also. And because of this ability, you can wonder and plan based on what you think they might be thinking. You have the ability to scan dozens of permutations of how a decision will affect your family, your social group, your work options, and your personal happiness.
That's true. One of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, has referred to a person's ability to think about thinking as third thoughts. It takes a unique sense of self to be able to conceptualize that deeply. Before we fall too much further into the rabbit hole that is the human psyche, I think we ought to give our listeners a nice, concrete, relatable example.
I can do that. Let's say the concept you're chewing on here is whether or not to have a child. Now, there's going to be huge impacts on your life for decades to come, and while you, probably for the best, can't really know the full implications until it's too late, you can understand the gravity of such a big decision. Your cat, on the other hand, knows that it's a fully functioning male, and that the female a few feet away is in heat. Soon there will be kittens. Cute, fuzzy little kittens. Little tiny paws. They're so cute. But the gravity of their social contract is not a layer of consciousness that the cat possesses. Tommy can't consider the situation and decide not to breed with Mittens because he thinks she might not be the best mother. I think one of the best ways to demonstrate the distinctions between the way I perceive the world and how my cat perceives the world, maybe perceive is the wrong word because a cat can see better, hear better, and smell better than I can. Maybe contextualize is a better way to say it. The best scientific demonstration of this is something called the mirror test. Can you break that down for us, Brandon? Wait, don't break the mirror test. Just explain what it is and what it has to do with consciousness, please.
I remember learning about this test in Psychology 101 way back in the day. I've always liked the idea of it, even though the arguments about its flaws are pretty reasonable. The mirror test, or mirror self-recognition test, is actually fairly simple in its application. An animal, or human, or whatever living organism is being tested, is anesthetized. Then a spot or a marker of some kind, a sticker or something else eye-catching, is put on an area of the body that the creature can't usually see. Once it wakes up, a mirror is introduced, and the test begins in earnest. If the animal changes its behavior after seeing the spot in the mirror, for example, checking or touching the spot on its own body after seeing it in the mirror, the creature is said to have successfully passed the MSR. Why is this important? Well, it takes a certain amount of self-awareness for an animal to be able to look into a mirror and recognize the image it sees as being a reflection of themselves. They need to have a concept of themselves. Let's use our cat example from an event I actually experienced. I had placed a full-length mirror at the top of my stairs. One of my cats patted its way up and immediately saw his own reflection in the mirror. Animals that are considered to be able to recognize themselves in a mirror typically progress through 4 stages of behavior when initially introduced to that mirror. Stage 1 starts with social responses. In the case of my cat, that meant puffing up 3 times its size, hissing, and ready to defend his territory from an unknown foreign feline. Stage 2 is physical inspection. This happened a minute later when my cat decided to start batting gently at the mirror, looking behind the mirror, trying to find a way to this other cat. Stage 3 is called repetitive mirror testing behavior. This was the last stage that my cat actually progressed to. He would move a little, meow at the mirror, prod it, move, walk so he could no longer see his reflection in the mirror, come back, rinse, then repeat. The final stage is stage 4, realization of seeing themselves. And only a few creatures have ever managed this level of self-recognition. A few primates, dolphins, and the only non-mammal, the magpie.
One of the theories about why some species can pass the mirror test and why some can't comes down to their social lives. An animal species that is longer lived and in nature lives in a larger social group is far more likely to pass the mirror test, because the larger the social group, the more important it is for each individual to devote increasing amounts of mental energy to determine one's place in the pecking order. So, who's the current leader? What's my relationship to that leader? Who's about to become the new leader? And should I be working to sweet talk the gal or guy who's going to be in charge tomorrow? Something like who the leader is seems like a minor detail, but in many animal groups, the alpha determines if the others in the group are permitted to breed. And if there's one thing a life form prioritizes and incentivizes, it's reproduction. It's one of the strongest biological imperatives. And if it takes a bloody coup to get permission to have your baby, there will be blood. Calculating and forecasting for our future benefit is what defines humans, from stocking food away in the root cellar to survive the winter, which squirrels also do, so maybe not so distinctive, to building a dam to generate power, irrigate crops, and prevent floods. A highly developed sense of one's own mind and the sense of the other is a big part of what sets cats apart from people.
I don't know how distinctive building a dam is. Beavers build dams, though not hydroelectric ones. Honestly, I think that defining consciousness requires a diverse collection of considerations. It isn't useful to think of it as individual elements, especially ones that might be duplicated by animal instinct. But we're spending a lot of time talking about furry creatures. Think it's about time to move on to humans? And talk about depression more directly?
I think there's a lot of things to consider with depression that somehow always get skipped in all the other things I've heard or read, and we're not going to make that mistake. But you're getting tired of fuzzy critters, are you? I get it. So let's go abstract for a bit and talk about another mental construct, stress. We've already had an episode devoted to stress, but refresh us if you would please. Episode 2 was a long time ago. My ancestors spent thousands of years scraping for survival, living on bark and bugs, fighting for a good mate, defending the tribe from angry hippos. How has this prepared me for my modern life of sitting quietly in an office cubicle, a domesticated beast tapping on keys? And what's the impacts of stress on my health?
It's certainly true that today's stressors are very different from the stressors that helped shape your tree leaf devouring, giant sloth fighting ancestors. In some ways, though, that's perfectly okay. Stress plays an integral role in assisting us in adapting to new situations. In order for your body to change, a certain amount of stress is necessary. For example, in order to improve your cardiovascular health, you need to increase your heart rate and put some stress on your system with a certain amount of regularity. We call it exercise. Stress is also your body's way of responding to any kind of demand or threat. When you sense danger, real or imagined, your body releases a whole set of chemicals to change your physiology. You've probably referred to this as the fight or flight response. The bigger problem with stress is that the human nervous system isn't particularly good at distinguishing between when emotions are triggering a response and actual physical threats. If you're experiencing an emotional response over a deadline at the office, your unpaid bills, or the verbal joust you just had with your spouse last night, your body reacts with the same intensity it would during a real-life threatening event. To add to this dilemma, the more frequently the body puts itself in fight or flight mode, the more easily and frequently it will do so in the future. If you tend to get stressed frequently, which, let's be honest, everyone I interact with does, your body is experiencing the physiological effects of that stress more often and more easily each day. And, as you suspected, ongoing and excessive stress can lead to serious health problems. Chronic stress can affect nearly every system in your body. It can suppress your immune system, upset your digestive and reproductive systems, increase the risk of heart attack and stroke, even speed up the aging process.
All right, I'm going to shift gears slightly now from the furry mammalian to the scaly reptilian. Or rather, you're going to, good sir, if you'll indulge me. Now, what can you tell us, in as simple terms as you can, about the lizard brain? And I'm not talking about some exotic cuisine here, but instead the neuroscience angle.
Thank goodness you didn't want a recipe for lizard brain tartare. I'll tell you what I know about the lizard brain theory, although I'll admit my knowledge about it is a little topical. The lizard brain theory, more officially known as the triune brain theory, was originally developed by Dr. Paul MacLean, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist, in the 1960s. He differentiated areas of the brain as having developed from specific parts of our evolutionary history, namely the reptile, the early mammal, and the modern primate. His theory stated that these three portions of the brain still exist and are constantly in conflict with each other, that every person essentially has three separate, semi-independent brains, each, quote, with its own special intelligence, its own subjectivity, its own sense of time and space, and its own memory, end quote. The lizard brain from this theory was initially equated to the limbic portions of the brain, and he believed these lizard portions controlled emotional responses like aggression and dominance, as well as the more automatic functions and ingrained animal instincts. The physiological portions of this theory have more or less been disproven over time. However, specific portions of the brain have been proven to be critical for specific functions, and as a thought experiment, I think the theory still holds merit. Here's an example to illustrate my point. I don't really like tests. I can do well if I'm given adequate time to prepare and do plenty of practice exams. If you were to ask me questions in a social setting or at the office, or even ask me to give a speech, I can recall information with crystal clarity. However, put me in front of a crisp sheet of multiple choice bubbles and hand me a number 2 pencil, well, sometimes it feels like the calm, cool, collected person I usually am is overtaken by something much less reasonable. The idea that some portion of my personality is directly conflicting with another part doesn't seem quite so absurd. Weird, right?
If you think consciousness is weird, try really studying the structure of the human brain sometime. From one perspective, it's made up of these successive layers that increase in complexity. Simply put, the most basic layers regulate things like your heart beating, breathing, digestion, and then there are specialized regions to process the sensory input, vision, sound, smells, touch. Other regions control voluntary movement, sex drive, aggression, fear. Others handle decision making. And all the sections, lobes, layers, whatever you want to call them, most complex animals have them, from a lizard to a cat to a human. But the humans also have brain layers for higher reasoning and increased social processing.
It's all social this and social that from you today. I could have sworn you wanted to be a hermit when you grew up.
I'm talking about brain science here. You should be happy. There's even a specialized section of the human brain specifically programmed to remember human faces. And how do we know about this section of the brain? Because some people have damage to this portion. It's called the fusiform gyrus. And these poor folks can't recognize faces at all. Think about that. Not recognizing the face of your mom, your spouse, your children. You know them, you can remember everything else about them, you can recognize them by their voice, their clothes, and so on. But every face you see is a stranger's face, even someone you know intimately and spend hours with every day. Can you imagine that?
It would certainly be difficult, but people learn to work around all sorts of problems in impressive and astonishing ways.
That's true. There was a time way, way back in human development when we did not yet have the face recognition layer. But there was never a time when we were lacking the lizard brain. The breathing and heart beating are pretty fundamental to our type of life form. But biology doesn't get rid of more primitive designs in favor of new innovations. It just adds the new innovations in on top. If your brain was a power station, over here there'd be a section burning wood in a campfire. And then over here, another section running a coal power plant. And then over there, a nuclear power station. So the lizard brain is still in there in the human head. It wants things. Maybe it wants an entire bag of Oreos. Maybe it wants to literally bite the head off the guy who's flirting with my wife. I'm much smarter than my lizard brain, but he's my oldest friend, and maybe sometimes I let him drive for a few minutes. What's that? A goofy example from Mike? It must be a Wednesday. But I hope I made my point. Our brains are made up of many, many, many different parts, and consciousness, from my perspective, is the discussion that all of these parts are having every moment of every day. So Brandon, what's your personal perspective on the source of consciousness? This doesn't have to be referenced from some scientific paper. What's your gut tell you?
I agree pretty strongly with your thoughts on consciousness. The tendency and desire of modern Western medicine is reductionist. In other words, the hope is always to find the smallest possible unit that defines or controls something. I've read articles from 2009, 2014, and even more recently in 2016, all of which had the same headline: Scientists are closing in on the physical source of consciousness. Each time the area of the brain being discussed is different, or bigger, or another portion of the brain is also involved. My gut tells me that attempting to define consciousness in terms of a single physical component of the brain will always lack the depth needed to create a useful definition of consciousness. The interaction of the portions of the brain, in the right way, under the right conditions, I think those interactions will turn out to be key to understanding and defining where consciousness comes from.
As complex as the brain is, it really is amazing that it works as well as it does. I know you've been waiting for this very simple question, which I'm sure has a very simple answer. What is depression? Hold on. Since I like you, let me make that a slightly more reasonable question. What are the symptoms of depression, and how's it diagnosed?
First of all, thank you for the modification to your initial question. I was a little worried I'd have to start things off with another one of my "no one really knows, it's all a guessing game" answers. Any form of mental emotional disorder can be incredibly difficult to diagnose. Think about it. Physicians prefer to rely on objective findings to diagnose an illness. A patient comes in with a sore throat, and after a swab and some time, we come to a diagnosis of strep throat, because the test for the streptococcus organism comes back positive. Send that throat swab to any lab in the world, and as long as the correct procedures are followed, that test for the streptococcus organism will always come back positive. An objective finding is something that can be perceived by someone other than the patient themselves. Even something as simple as dark bags under a patient's eyes can be a powerful diagnostic tool. For physicians, some problems start up when we need to rely on subjective findings. Subjective symptoms are those that can only be perceived by the patient themselves. Think about things like pain or vertigo. If a patient describes their pain on a scale of 1 to 10 as a 7, how would anyone else confirm that this was true? Would one patient's 7 equate to another patient's 2? Maybe. The point is that there's no way to know for certain, one way or the other. When we start talking about psychological disorders, like depression for example, we end up with a set of primary symptoms that are almost entirely subjective. To receive an official Western diagnosis of major depressive disorder, basically clinical depression, there's a whole list of specific symptoms a patient has to have for a specific period of time. The definitive work for the diagnosis of psychological conditions is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. While it's useful for mental health practitioners, it can be incredibly difficult to navigate for, say, the average Joe.
Well, that's fine, but I am the average Joe, Brandon, and I just looked up the DSM. Apparently they're up to edition 5, and that thing is 947 pages. 947. There's no way I'm going to read through that thing in the hopes of learning that I'm depressed.
And you shouldn't. The DSM is definitely more a tool for professionals, basically the answer to the part of your question on how depression is diagnosed. Instead, let me give you a short list of symptoms you ought to keep an eye out for. And I'll apologize in advance, the list is kind of a long one. Persistent, sad, anxious, or empty mood, feelings of hopelessness, pessimism, feelings of guilt, worthlessness, helplessness, loss of interest or pleasure in hobbies and activities, decreased energy, fatigue, feeling slowed down, difficulty concentrating, remembering, and making decisions, insomnia, early morning awakening, or oversleeping, low appetite and weight loss, or overeating and weight gain, thoughts of death or suicide, even suicide attempts, restlessness, irritability, and persistent physical symptoms that do not respond to treatment, such as headaches, digestive disorders, and pain for which no other cause can be diagnosed.
One of the serious problems with the descriptions of almost every disease or illness I've ever heard about is how vague and typical it all is. It's almost like going to a really low-quality psychic who tells you she senses you work too hard and are unappreciated at work and at home, and you are destined for great things. With symptoms like fatigue, aches, problems with sleep, digestive issues, these could be anything from anemia to diabetes to lupus. I mean, how do I know if I'm depressed, and how do I know if I have mono? One of the symptoms of depression is a lack of interest or lack of ability to get motivated to change things for the better. It's like you've got this brain fungus that saps all of your will. All you have to do is make it to the medicine cabinet and take your antifungal pill, but that's the one thing you can't make yourself do. To rephrase, depression sounds horrible, and even getting properly diagnosed sounds like an ordeal. What are the leading thoughts on what causes depression?
You've just asked the million-dollar question regarding depression. Heck, regarding most mental emotional conditions. What causes depression? The short answer is, I know everyone's going to be surprised, nobody really knows. You asked for leading thoughts, though, so, again, I'll do my best. For the most part, Western medicine attributes clinically diagnosed depression to some form of brain chemistry imbalance. It can be caused by a physical abnormality in the brain, an excess or deficiency in production of a neurochemical, even an issue with correct uptake or processing of those neurochemicals. There are a wide variety of indirect potential causes for these sorts of imbalances. Insufficient vitamin levels and even lack of adequate sunlight has been suspected as a potential causal factor in depression. But long story short, the list of possible causes of depression is a long one, with no clear-cut answer.
For my research, the possible causes of depression being listed is everything from Lyme disease, which you get from a tick bug, not from a lime fruit, strangely enough, malnutrition, side effects of prescription drugs, which just makes it all so much harder to get a handle on. Sometimes the causes can be pretty clear. Perhaps a person had a very abusive childhood or some severe trauma they've never recovered from, but often there's just no clear cause we can point to. But what if
Oh dear. The dreaded what if. I'll just warn our listeners. The following is based loosely on facts but may bear no resemblance to the truth.
Hey now.
Because I feel a Mike Davalos level speculation coming on.
You feel correctly. One of my completely unscientific ideas about the causes for depression is something I've already referred to. For most of human history and prehistory, we had to fight for everything. Hunt down each morsel of food, build your own hut, kidnap your own wife from the neighboring tribe. Everything was a struggle, and now we just get trophies for participation. We just show up to the buffet. And so we have all this skill and power and raw potential with nothing to do with it, but hold down a 9 to 5 job. Makes me think of autoimmune disorders, which we touched on briefly in the episode on gluten, where your own immune system attacks your body tissues. There's some studies that indicate the recent increase of autoimmune disorders might be due in part to the fact that in the modern world, our bodies are no longer exposed to a lot of the viruses and bacteria that we once were. We're not infested with parasites, intestinal worms, giardia, even toxoplasmosis. And that last one sounds familiar. It has to do with cats, I think.
The parasite responsible for toxoplasmosis does reproduce inside a cat. That's true. And in all actuality, there are some reasonable theories that more Americans than you might expect are actually infested with parasites. Even the CDC released some reports to that effect not too long ago. That might be a little bit more off topic than we ought to go right now, though.
I know. I'm not trying to wander off the path, I promise. I'm trying to get somewhere. See, in the past, our immune systems had to be turned up to 11 just to keep us alive long enough to breed. But now the immune system has a lot less work to do, and we have no way to grab that knob and turn it down. We've touched on this before when we mentioned epigenetics. Anyway, there's some treatment approaches for autoimmune disorders that actually involve intentionally infecting the patient with a parasite. Now, this is still experimental, but the results are encouraging in animal models, whatever that means. So, what am I suggesting? Kidnapping depressed people, dropping them into a brutal environment where they either learn to fight, hunt, gather, or die as a treatment for depression? I would totally watch the pilot of that TV episode, by the way. But no, that's not what I'm suggesting. It would probably work, though. But I don't know what to suggest. That's just my crackpot theory. If it's not from a known trauma, it might just be a lack of fights to fight. And what's your own personal educated guess for the causes of depression? In those instances where there's no obvious trauma.
I think looking for a single cause of depression is just as unlikely to bear fruit as looking for just one brain structure to be responsible for consciousness. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, the balance of chemicals in the brain will play a role in depression. That much is true. But the cause of depression in one person is extremely unlikely to be the same across the board. And I think a better way to consider the problem is to look, once again, at the interplay of a patient's conditions. Is their vitamin B12 low? Do they tend to exercise too little? Maybe they're simply going through a longer-term set of stressors at home at the same time as they're having some problems with their boss at work. Combine all of these things, see how they interact, and I suspect that's where you'll find the most useful causal factors for depression. And I recognize that isn't a particularly useful statement. How do you help someone stop experiencing depression if so many uncontrollable factors play a role?
That's exactly what my next question was going to be about. What can you tell us about the standard Western treatment for depression?
Western medicine generally treats depression with a mixture of pharmaceuticals and sometimes the use of psychotherapy. Although it's my experience that psychotherapy has been declining as a used modality, as antidepressants become more and more accepted for long-term use. Antidepressants attempt to modify the creation, uptake, or reuptake of a few of those neurochemicals I mentioned earlier that are considered an integral part of mood regulation. Unfortunately, there's no real measurement methods, nor causal explanation as to why these chemicals might be out of balance, or even which one is specifically responsible for a person's depression. According to the main article about depression on the NIMH website, that's the National Institute of Mental Health, quote, antidepressants are medicines that treat depression. They may help improve the way your brain uses certain chemicals that control mood or stress, end quote. I guess the takeaway is that the most common Western medicine approach is to try a number of pharmaceuticals and see what works.
I think that's about what we've come to expect from watching TV. But what about Eastern medicine? How do the treatments differ?
Well, to some degree, the initial approach isn't that dissimilar. Once a patient's overall condition has been diagnosed, an herbal formula is often one of the most powerful tools a physician has at their disposal. The herbs will be selected not necessarily to treat depression, but instead to treat the overall condition of the patient. Additional herbs may be added to assist in lightening the depression as well, of course. However, Chinese medicine, at least the way I was taught it, does focus a little bit more on relieving the potential root causes for ongoing depression. The herbal formula isn't intended to fix the problem in its entirety. Instead, once the depression has been improved, steps will be taken, with the dedication of the patient, to improve diet, exercise, and lifestyle considerations that may be playing into a long-standing depression. Once the conditions of the patient's life are changing for the better, oftentimes the herbal formula changes right along with it to treat the new overall diagnosis.
I've already used a lot of random things in my examples, from cats to nuclear power stations, and just when you thought I was done, I have more! I always have more. Okay, so you're a medical, sciencey guy, but you're also a computer techie guy. You know hardware, programming. You're the whole enchilada, my friend. So I know you'll smell what I'm cooking when I take a moment to look at the human mind as a computer.
I certainly hope so. I'll admit that I've often had my own thoughts in that direction. You should check out the Computational Theory of Mind and the books written on the subject if that kind of thing piques your interest. I'll also admit that now I want an enchilada. Your metaphors have slowly shifted from cats to food. Getting hungry?
Now that you mention it, I am. Maybe I'll nibble a cheese stick while you're answering that next question. Let's imagine your brain is a smartphone. There's an operating system. On iPhones right now, it's called iOS 11. And the operating system, or OS, is a base layer of programming that allows the different parts of the hardware, the camera, the microphone, the memory, the speakers. The OS allows all of these things to communicate and coordinate with each other. So the OS is kind of like the lizard brain. Are you with me so far?
I think any computer science majors or technology buffs are probably cringing right now, but yes, I'm with you. Continue.
And then on your phone, you can download apps, applications, computer programs that are another layer on top of the OS that lets you share pictures and videos with Snapchat, or watch a video on Netflix, or listen to music on Spotify. Your brain can download apps too, or more accurately, it writes the apps as you're learning the skill. So as you learn to walk, talk, feed yourself, these are all apps and achievements you build up over time. Are you with me?
Yes, I believe I am. Life is an ever-growing app store. That's deep. Continue.
I think it might help to think of the mind as a smartphone because some apps don't play well with others. Some apps try to gobble up all your memory. Others are trying to track your location or track your steps during a jog or let you play a game. But sometimes you start to realize that certain problems you have with your phone only happen when specific apps are open. Say I've got the Facebook app open and I try to open Spotify to listen to some music. And whenever I open Spotify, the Facebook app crashes. Now, the programmers of the apps might know exactly what's going on, but it's hard to say from the user's perspective which phone app is the problem. And even though the Facebook app is the one doing the bad thing, which is crashing, it might actually be due to something the Spotify app is trying to do and failing.
I'm really hoping you're going to tell me that error logs are involved somehow in this theory you're weaving. That would make things a whole lot easier on people like me who have to troubleshoot the problem.
Maybe, but you'd have to be trained to know where to look for the list of errors, and most people wouldn't spend the time. But it's not important, though. What is important is, just like the Spotify app and the Facebook app, things in your mind, like thoughts and drives, that can conflict. Just like you can get a song stuck in your head, certain memories can get caught in a loop. This is a really tame example, but maybe somebody laughed at you one day at work while you were doing your best in a big presentation. And now you're afraid to speak up at work anymore because you just keep reliving that bad moment over and over again. It just kind of saps your will to participate. Now with a bigger trauma like childhood abuse, rape, car accident, you might end up not just sapped during presentations at work, but sapped in your whole life. Now in a computer system, you can select a little problem program, a stuck little thought process, and just force it to close with a click. It's very hard to do that with the brain, but with time and therapy, you can learn to break a repeating thought cycle where you revisit negative experiences. And a drug called ketamine is one approach that's being explored. Can you explain this one for us?
Ketamine is a drug which has most commonly been used as an anesthetic for horses, although it has found a home as a recreational drug as well. Honestly, I don't know a whole lot about the exact methods by which ketamine is supposed to work in terms of its antidepressant properties. From what I understand, it's actually a metabolite of ketamine. In other words, a byproduct the body creates as it processes ketamine that does the real work. Most importantly, though, a few recent studies have shown that ketamine seems to be able, in some patients for whom no other pharmaceutical treatment or psychotherapy has worked, to provide in a few hours relief equivalent to 6 weeks or more of traditional therapies.
Yeah, the ketamine approach still seems poorly understood at this point. Maybe it's quieting overactive brain centers or performing some kind of reboot, to revisit my smartphone analogy. Not that this is a credible example to point to, but I remember an episode of House MD, the TV show, where Dr. House, who suffers from chronic pain, he wanted to use ketamine to reboot his pain center while he was in a medically induced coma. Now, I know historically a person suffering behavioral problems might have been subjected to an exorcism or something called trepanning. That's drilling holes in your skull. But we're living in the future here, man. What can you tell me about modern alternative or experimental treatment options other than ketamine?
Well, maybe one of the most interesting alternative potential therapies out there involves the use of psychedelics, and specifically the substance psilocybin, naturally found in certain mushrooms. Over the course of the last year or so, several studies have shown that these hallucinogenic compounds seem to have a significantly positive effect in treating depression. Because this drug is still listed as Category 1, in-depth research is still ongoing. The precise mechanism and action of these types of drugs isn't fully understood. There's one theory that psilocybin reduces overactivity in certain areas of the brain. Another states that psilocybin may create antidepressant results by adjusting the brain's reaction to stressful stimuli, decreasing the likelihood that you'll end up in a fight or flight state from stressors of all varieties. No one really knows at this point if this line of research will lead to a viable method of treating intractable depression, but the results, limited as they are so far, are promising enough to merit mentioning.
Of all of these treatments, is there any clear standout that's proven to work more often or more quickly or last longer? Or is this a lifetime effort type of problem?
At the moment, research is still ongoing to determine what, if anything, works fastest and best in treating depression. Western medicines, herbal formulas, psychotherapy. It seems like the mixture of modalities that works best is entirely dependent on the individual being treated. For some people, a single pill is all it takes to get them back on the road to recovery. For others, even electric shock therapy isn't enough to provide long-term relief from their depression. Substances that are less clinically accepted here in the US, like psilocybin and ketamine, are showing great promise, but there just isn't enough evidence yet to say conclusively that they work more quickly or last longer.
As I mentioned before, science still cannot really explain how consciousness works, so determining what's causing a persistent depressive state is elusive, and treating it in any way seems like it might be something of a dangerous proposition. Would you please explain the major hazards of treating depression?
There are always dangers when treating any condition, especially with pharmaceuticals, and depression is especially concerning. In order to try and provide relief from depressive symptoms, you have to remember, Western practitioners are directly manipulating the chemicals in the brain that adjust mood and emotional reactions. Doing so is not an exact science, and anytime you change a critical chemical balance, side effects are bound to occur. The most common of these side effects are nausea, increased appetite, weight gain, loss of sex drive and other related sexual problems, fatigue and drowsiness, insomnia, anxiety, irritability, and almost every antidepressant carries the risk of increased suicidal ideation, meaning the patient might be more likely to want to kill themselves. If you notice that many of the side effects of the drugs for treating depression actually resemble the symptoms of having depression, well noticed.
Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we wrap it up?
We've really only scratched the surface of a topic that has nearly infinite layers of complexity. When I envisioned what the podcast might involve to discuss the topic of depression, I honestly didn't realize how involved and complicated a topic it would be to even get to some of the basic questions regarding the nature of a widespread and increasingly common condition here in the US. If it seems like we only glossed over important information, or if our answers were more based in personal theory than usual, I'd ask you to keep in mind a critical fact about psychological disorders in general. For the most part, we just don't know. We don't know the physiological root cause or causes of an illness like depression. We don't have the tools to measure some of the biochemistry we would need to monitor to get a better understanding. Heck, we don't even know if we understand things well enough that we're heading in the right direction to develop those tools. The important thing, especially for our listeners who are concerned they might be depressed or be suffering from long-term depression, is not to be disheartened by the seeming lack of knowledge. Even with the risks and unknowns involved in treatment of depression, it's crucial that, even if you aren't sure if you're depressed, or if you have doubts about treatments, you go and see an appropriate physician or specialist. Depression is nothing to underestimate. It can sap your energy, ruin your self-esteem, and make every task in your life more difficult. If you think you may be suffering from depression, or if you find yourself in a dark place, please seek help and be open to the work ahead of you. Even if it takes several tries to find the treatment that works for you, there is hope that you will find something that meets your needs. Depression is hard, and I believe we'll have another episode or 3 to cover the topic appropriately. But there are options if you're willing to work at it and accept help. That can make you feel better.
That's all the time we have for today. These short episodes are a brief overview of very complex topics. Everything we say is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Licensed healthcare professionals should advise you and be aware of changes you're planning to make to any aspect of your healthcare. Every person's needs are different. The links to references we've made about news articles, medical studies, or other materials can be found at level989.com, along with our contact information and the complete "Don't take medical advice from podcasts" disclaimer. Thanks for listening, and now go help yourself.